Dr. Isabella Santos stood at the observation window of Research Station Helios, watching the unfamiliar constellations of the Carina sector drift by. Behind her, the soft hum of laboratory equipment provided a comforting backdrop to her racing thoughts. Today would mark the first collaborative research project between human scientists and the Meridians, a species known for their remarkable scientific achievements and equally remarkable emotional detachment. The station's warning chime announced the approaching shuttle. Isabella straightened her lab coat and checked her reflection in the reinforced glass. At 45, her dark hair had started showing streaks of silver, but her eyes still held the same enthusiasm that had driven her to become one of Earth's leading xenobiologists. The airlock cycled, and Isabella turned to face her new research partner. Zach Seth emerged with fluid grace, his iridescent scales shifting from deep purple to midnight blue under the station's lights. Like all Meridians, he stood nearly 7 feet tall, with an elegant, serpentine neck and 4 arms that moved with precise coordination. His large, multifaceted eyes studied Isabella with unwavering focus. "Dr. Santos," he said, his translator converting his harmonic tones into crisp English. "I trust our collaboration will prove productive." No greeting, no pleasantries, typical Meridian efficiency. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Zach Seth," Isabella replied warmly, offering a smile that went unacknowledged. "I've prepared our primary lab space with samples from both Earth and Meridian ecosystems." They walked together through the station's corridors, their footsteps echoing in synchronized rhythm. Isabella found herself filling the silence with explanations about their research goals, studying the convergent evolution of neural structures across different planetary biospheres. Zach Seth listened without comment, occasionally tilting his head in what Isabella had learned was a Meridian gesture of data acquisition. The lab itself was Isabella's pride and joy, a state-of-the-art facility with equipment from both civilizations. As she demonstrated the human scanning devices, she noticed Zach Seth's scales rippling in what might have been interest, or irritation. "Your equipment seems inefficient," he finally commented, examining a neural imaging device. "Meridian technology could complete these scans in 1/3 the time." Isabella laughed, surprising Zach Seth enough that his scales flickered to a pale lavender. "That's exactly why you're here. We have much to learn from each other." "Learn?" Zach Seth's inner eyelids blinked rapidly. "Your species' emotional responses often interfere with clear observation. Even now, you display unnecessary facial movements that serve no research purpose." Isabella's smile didn't fade, but it softened into something more thoughtful. "Those unnecessary expressions are part of how we process and share information, Dr. Zach Seth. They're as much a part of our scientific process as your analytical detachment is part of yours." "Fascinating." Zach Seth made a notation on his personal device. "You defend inefficiency with more inefficiency. Yet your species has achieved remarkable technological progress despite these handicaps." Rather than take offense, Isabella saw an opportunity. She pulled up a holographic display of human brain activity during various emotional states. "What you call handicaps, we consider essential to our understanding of the universe. Look at these neural patterns during moments of inspiration, joy, even grief. They're complex, interconnected, beautiful." Zach Seth studied the displays with increasing attention, his scales shifting through shades of blue and violet. "The energy expenditure is considerable. Yet the pattern recognition capabilities appear enhanced during these emotional states." "Exactly." Isabella's enthusiasm caused Zach Seth to take a small step backward. "Sorry," she added, moderating her tone. "But this is why cross-species research is so valuable. We see the universe through different lenses." As they began calibrating their equipment for the first series of experiments, Isabella's personal communicator chimed softly. A message from Earth, from her daughter Lucia. She would read it later, during her rest period. For now, she had a bridge to build between two very different ways of understanding the universe. Zach Seth observed her quick glance at the communicator. You are distracted by personal correspondence. Shall we reschedule for optimal efficiency? No need, Isabella replied, already focusing on their work. Humans are quite capable of managing multiple thought processes. You might find it inefficient, but sometimes the most remarkable discoveries come from letting our minds wander down unexpected paths. The Meridian scientist made another notation, his scales now showing a pattern Isabella hadn't seen before. She wished, not for the first time, that she better understood their chromatic emotional language. But that, she supposed, was what they were here to study, the many ways consciousness manifests across the galaxy, and the many ways it can be understood. Little did either of them know that their research into neural patterns and consciousness would soon become intensely personal, as the universe prepared to teach them both lessons about consciousness, emotion, and the bridges that can be built between the most different of minds. 3 weeks into their research, Isabella finally found time to read Lucia's message. The lab was quiet during the station's night cycle, with only the soft pulsing of monitoring equipment breaking the silence. As she opened the communication, her hands trembled slightly. Lucia rarely sent formal messages, preferring quick video calls. The words on the screen made her blood run cold. Stage 4 glioblastoma. Inoperable. 6 months, maybe less. Isabella read the message 3 times, each word burning itself into her consciousness. Her daughter, her brilliant, beautiful Lucia, who had just started her residency at New Jakarta Medical Center, was dying. She didn't realize she had dropped her tablet until she heard it clatter against the floor. The sound drew Zach Setha's attention from his late-night analysis of neural tissue samples. "Dr. Santos, you appear to be malfunctioning," he observed, his scales shifting to a deep indigo, a color she had learned indicated intense focus. "Your epidermis has lost significant coloration, and your motor control appears impaired." Isabella tried to speak, but no words came. Instead, a sob escaped her throat, raw and primal. She pressed her hands against her mouth, trying to contain the sound, but it was like trying to hold back a tsunami with a paper screen. Zach Seth approached cautiously, his head tilted in that familiar data-gathering angle. "Your emotional response suggests receipt of significant negative information. Do you require medical assistance?" "My daughter," Isabella finally managed to whisper. "She's dying." Saying the words aloud made them real, and she felt her knees buckle. She grabbed the edge of the lab bench to steady herself. The Meridian scientist's scales rippled with rapid color changes, purple to blue to a gray she had never seen before. He seemed to be processing this information through his species' analytical framework. "Ah. This explains the irregularities I've observed in your work patterns recently. Your attention has been divided by anticipation of this communication." Isabella couldn't help but laugh, though it came out more like a choke. "Yes, Zach Seth. That would be an accurate scientific observation of my recent behavior." She wiped her eyes, leaving streaks of moisture on her lab coat sleeves. "I need to request emergency leave. I have to go back to Earth." "That would be highly inefficient," Zach Seth stated. "Our research is at a crucial phase. The neural mapping of cross-species emotional responses requires consistent monitoring and..." "Inefficient?" Isabella's voice rose sharply, causing Zach Setha's scales to flicker in surprise. "My daughter is dying. I don't care about efficiency right now. I don't care about neural mapping or research protocols or any of it." The Meridian took a step backward, his scales now pulsing with rapid patterns she couldn't interpret. "Your emotional state is causing you to reject logical analysis. This is precisely the kind of response our research aims to understand. Perhaps we could incorporate your current condition into our study parameters." Isabella stared at him, momentarily speechless. In all their weeks of working together, she had tried to bridge the gap between their different ways of perceiving the world. She had defended emotional responses as valuable data points, had explained the role of feelings in human scientific discovery. But now, Faced with her own crisis, she found herself wanting to throw something at his perfectly logical, perfectly alien head. Instead, she took a deep breath, drawing on years of diplomatic training. "Zach Seth, I am going to explain something, and I need you to record it as important xenobiological data. Humans cannot simply compartmentalize our emotions. When we receive news that someone we love is dying, it affects everything, our work, our thoughts, our physical well-being. This isn't inefficiency. This is part of what makes us human." Zach Seth's scales settled into a steady, deep blue as he made notes on his device. "You suggest that this emotional disruption serves a purpose beyond merely interfering with productive work?" "Yes," Isabella said, her voice thick with tears she was trying to hold back. "These feelings, this pain, it connects us. It reminds us why we do our work, why we explore the universe, why we reach out to other species. It's not just about gathering data or making discoveries. It's about understanding life in all its forms, including its end." The Meridian scientist was silent for a long moment, his scales shifting through subtle variations of blue and violet. Finally, he spoke, "I will assist in preparing the necessary documentation for your emergency leave. And I will continue our research, incorporating these new observations about human emotional responses to mortality." Isabella managed a weak smile. "Thank you, Zach Seth." She picked up her fallen tablet, her daughter's message still glowing on the screen. "You know what's ironic? Lucia was studying neural oncology. She wanted to understand how human consciousness adapts to terminal conditions. Now she's going to experience it firsthand. This appears to be causing you additional distress," Zach Seth observed. "Yet you choose to share this information. Why?" "Because that's another thing humans do, Zach Seth. When we're hurting, we share it with others. Even with those who might not fully understand." As Isabella began making arrangements for her return to Earth, she didn't notice the subtle change in Zach Seth's scale patterns, a new color, barely visible, that had never been recorded in any xenobiological database. The first physical sign that something was shifting in the Meridian scientist's carefully ordered world. The message came during a routine neural tissue analysis. "Immediate priority transmission for Dr. Isabella Santos." The station's AI delivered it with the same neutral tone it used for dinner announcements. Isabella knew before opening it. A parent's intuition, perhaps, or simply the grim mathematics of terminal illness. Lucia was gone. This time, Isabella didn't drop anything. She didn't cry out. She simply sat very still, staring at the sterile lab wall, her fingers gripping the edge of her workstation until her knuckles turned white. She had returned to the station 2 months ago, after spending precious weeks with Lucia. Her daughter had insisted, "Mom, your work is important. I want you to finish it. Please." Now, in the antiseptic quiet of the lab, those last conversations played through her mind like worn holographic recordings. "Dr. Santos." Zach Seth's voice cut through her memories. "Your vital signs indicate severe emotional distress. More severe than previous instances." Isabella turned to face him. During her absence, he had continued their research, sending her detailed reports that she could barely focus on. Now he stood before her, his scales shifting through colors she had never seen him display before. "My daughter died this morning," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "On Earth, it's spring. She loved spring. The cherry blossoms would have been blooming outside her hospital window." The steadiness cracked then, her voice splintering like glass. Zach Seth moved closer, his 4 arms making small, uncertain gestures. "I have studied human grieving protocols during your absence. They suggest physical proximity and supportive vocalizations are appropriate responses. Would you find such behaviors helpful?" The question, so clinical, so desperately well-meaning, broke something loose in Isabella's chest. She began to laugh, but it transformed into deep, racking sobs. Years of professional distance fell away as she curled into herself, decades of scientific objectivity drowning in waves of raw grief. To her shock, she felt a hand on her shoulder, cool, scaled, tentative. Zach Seth had actually touched her, something Meridians almost never did with other species. "Your research," she managed to say between sobs, "what did it tell you about human grief?" "The data is inconsistent," he admitted. His scales were cycling through colors so rapidly they seemed to blur. "Human responses to death vary significantly. Some become non-functional for extended periods. Others increase their productivity to dangerous levels. Many exhibit seemingly contradictory behaviors simultaneously." He paused. "It is most inefficient." "Yes," Isabella whispered. "It is." "Yet," Zach Seth continued, his voice taking on an unusual hesitation, "I have observed that humans emerge from this process altered but intact. Enhanced, even, in some cases. I do not understand this paradox." Isabella wiped her eyes, looking up at her research partner. "What do Meridians do, Zach Seth? When someone dies?" "You've never told me." His scales settled into a deep, midnight blue. "We acknowledge the cessation of function. We redistribute their responsibilities. We continue our work. No mourning. No remembrance. Such practices were deemed inefficient in our evolution. They serve no practical purpose." Isabella stood suddenly, surprising them both. "Show me your species' historical records. All of them. There must be something, art, literature, any evidence of how your people processed loss before you became so." She gestured at his perfectly controlled posture, his precisely modulated voice. "Those records are restricted," Zach Seth said. "They are considered irrelevant to modern Meridian society." "Nothing about understanding consciousness is irrelevant," Isabella shot back. "That's what we're here to study, isn't it? The full spectrum of sentient experience." "Well, this is part of it, the messy, inefficient, crucial part that makes us who we are." Zach Seth was silent for a long moment, his scales showing that strange new color that had begun appearing recently. Finally, he moved to the main computer terminal. "The records you request are coded into our oldest genetic archives. They were deemed too significant to completely erase, but too dangerous to leave easily accessible." As he began to interface with the system, Isabella watched in fascination. She had never seen him appear so uncertain. His usual fluid grace was disrupted by small tremors, barely noticeable except to someone who had worked closely with him for months. "Dr. Santos," he said, still facing the terminal, "I must inform you that accessing these records is against Meridian protocol. It could result in significant consequences for my standing in the scientific community." Isabella felt a fresh wave of tears, but these were different. "You'd risk that? For this? You once told me that sometimes the most remarkable discoveries come from letting our minds wander down unexpected paths." His scales rippled with that new, unnamed color. "I find myself curious about where this path might lead." The terminal hummed to life, displaying ancient Meridian script that began to translate into human-readable text. As the first images appeared, paintings, sculptures, ritual documents, Isabella gasped. They showed Meridians with scales blazing in complex patterns, bodies intertwined in expressions of joy and grief, faces contorted in emotions that had been bred out of their species generations ago. "Oh, Zach Seth," she breathed. "You weren't always like this. Your people, they felt everything, didn't they? Just like we do." In the reflected light of the ancient artifacts, Zach Seth's scales shimmered with colors that hadn't been seen in his species for 1,000 years. The ancient Meridian archives transformed their research. Isabella and Zach Seth spent countless hours studying the recovered data, their original neural mapping project evolving into something far more profound. The historical records revealed a civilization that had once celebrated its emotional depth, until a catastrophic event led them to systematically suppress it. They called it the Great Severance, Zack explained one day, his scales displaying increasingly complex color patterns. A planetary war, triggered by what our historians labeled emotional contamination. The solution was to engineer ourselves toward logic and efficiency, removing the perceived source of conflict. Isabella looked up from a holographic display showing ancient Meridian morning rituals. But you didn't just remove conflict, did you? You removed everything: joy, love, grief. You traded your entire emotional spectrum for stability. It was considered a necessary evolution, Zack replied, but his voice held a new uncertainty. Yet these records suggest our ancestors possessed capabilities we have lost. Their scientific achievements were remarkable. They appeared to use emotional responses to drive innovation in ways we no longer understand. Isabella touched the display, enlarging an image of meridians performing what appeared to be a grief ceremony. Their scales showed color combinations she had never seen in modern members of the species, until recently, in Zack. "You're changing," she said softly. "Working on this project, studying these records, helping me through my grief, it's awakening something in you, isn't it?" Zack's scales flickered rapidly. "I am experiencing irregularities. My emotional suppression protocols appear to be functioning below optimal levels. I should report to the Meridian Science Council for adjustment, but..." He paused, his inner eyelids blinking rapidly. "I find myself reluctant to do so." Isabella felt her throat tighten. "Because you want to understand what's happening to you?" "Because I want to understand what happened to her," he said quietly. "Your daughter. I want to understand why her death affects you so deeply, and why watching your grief affects me in ways that should not be possible." Tears welled in Isabella's eyes, but for the first time since Lucia's death, they weren't entirely born of sorrow. "Tell me what you're feeling, Zack. Help me understand." His scales began to shift through colors that matched the ancient recordings. "When you speak of Lucia, my internal processes become disrupted. I experience physical sensations that correlate with ancient meridian descriptions of emotional responses. It is highly inefficient." His voice took on a strange quality. "Yet I find myself wanting to experience more." Isabella stood and moved closer to him, noting how he no longer withdrew from proximity as he once did. "What else?" "I have begun accessing my own genetic memory storage. Fragments of ancestral experiences, emotional data that should have been dormant." His scales rippled with that new color, the one that had started appearing after Lucia's death. "I dream, Dr. Santos. Meridians do not dream, yet I see images of grief rituals, of joy ceremonies, of..." He stopped, seeming to struggle with the concepts. "Of feeling," Isabella finished for him. "You're remembering how to feel." "It is dangerous," he said, but he made no move to step away. The Great Severance was implemented for logical reasons. These emotions, these connections, they make us vulnerable. They create chaos where there should be order. Isabella reached out and gently touched one of his scaled hands. This time, he didn't flinch. "They also make us stronger, Zack. When Lucia died, I thought the pain would destroy me. But it didn't. It changed me, yes, but it also connected me to something deeper, to every other being who has ever loved and lost. Including, it seems, your ancestors." Zack scales settled into a pattern that perfectly matched an ancient image of meridian compassion. "The Council will not accept these changes in me. They will view it as contamination, as regression. Or maybe," Isabella said, her scientific mind already racing ahead, "they'll see it as evolution. Not backward, but forward. Into something that combines the best of both paths, the logic you've mastered and the emotional depth you're rediscovering." As if in response to her words, Zack scales began to display a completely new pattern, one that appeared in neither the modern nor ancient records. Something entirely new, born from the bridge between two ways of being. In that moment, surrounded by the ghosts of Meridian history and the echo of human grief, both scientist and research project transformed into something neither of them had anticipated. They weren't just studying consciousness anymore, they were expanding it, one recovered emotion at a time. 6 months after discovering the ancient Meridian archives, Isabella stood before the Combined Sciences Council on Earth. Behind her, Zakseth towered in his formal scientific robes, his scales displaying a complex pattern that would have been impossible for his kind just a year ago. Our research has confirmed what we long suspected, Isabella began, her voice strong and clear in the vast chamber. Consciousness isn't just about neural pathways and synaptic responses. It's about the integration of emotional and logical processing, something both our species have approached from opposite extremes. The human scientists nodded thoughtfully. The Meridian representatives remained still, but their scales showed subtle signs of disquiet. Dr. Santos, one of the Meridian Council members spoke, "Your grief over your offspring's death has clearly influenced your scientific objectivity." And Dr. Zakseth. The council member's scales flickered with disapproval. "Your emotional contamination is evident." With respect, Zakseth replied, moving to stand beside Isabella, "What you call contamination, we have proven to be reclamation. Our ancestors understood something we forgot, that emotion and logic are not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of advanced consciousness." Isabella activated a holographic display showing neural scans. "These are Zakseth's brain patterns from 1 year ago." She swiped to a new image. "And these are his patterns now. The complexity has increased exponentially. He's not just accessing ancient emotional capabilities, he's developing new ones, integrating them with your species' logical evolution in ways your ancestors never achieved." The chamber erupted in murmurs and color shifts. Isabella continued, her voice growing passionate. "When my daughter died, I thought I was experiencing the ultimate failure of consciousness, the inability to prevent or change death. But through Zakseth, through watching him rediscover emotion, I learned something profound. Grief isn't just about loss. It's about growth." Zakseth's scales rippled with that unique pattern they had discovered together, the one that existed in neither human nor Meridian records. "My interaction with Dr. Santos's grief process initiated changes that should have been impossible according to our understanding of Meridian physiology. Yet here I stand, experiencing and processing emotions without losing the logical capabilities our species valued so highly. And your recommendation?" The human chair of the council leaned forward, intrigued. Isabella took a deep breath. "We propose a new field of study, emotional integration sciences. Not just for humans and Meridians, but for all sentient species. We've been so focused on understanding how different species think that we forgot to study how they feel. The implications for interspecies relations alone." One of the human scientists breathed. "Are potentially dangerous," a Meridian Council member cut in. "The Great Severance." Was a response to fear, Zakseth interrupted, his scales blazing with colors that made the council members draw back in shock. "We chose to eliminate emotion rather than learn to integrate it. We selected efficiency over growth. But look at humans, they have achieved remarkable scientific advancement while maintaining their emotional capacity. They have found strength in what we saw as weakness." Isabella touched her necklace, where a small hologram of Lucia smiled eternally. "My daughter's death brought me here, to this moment. She studied neural adaptation because she believed in the brain's ability to grow, to change, to survive. Through helping me understand my grief, Zakseth proved that such adaptation isn't limited to individuals or even species. It's a possibility that exists for all conscious beings." The chamber fell silent. Finally, the human chair spoke again. "And if we approve this new field of study? What's your next step?" Isabella and Zakseth exchanged glances. "We've already begun," she said. "We've identified 3 other species showing signs of emotional suppression similar to the Meridians. We believe we can help them recover their capacity for feeling while maintaining their other evolutionary advantages. And you believe this will benefit them? A Meridian Council member asked, scales showing skepticism. I believe, Zach Seth replied, that any species capable of grief is capable of growth. Dr. Santos showed me that truth. Now we wish to share it with others. As the council deliberated, Isabella felt a familiar ache in her chest, the ever-present grief for Lucia. But now it was accompanied by something else, hope. She looked up at Zach Seth, whose scales now displayed emotions no Meridian had shown in a millennium, and saw in him what her daughter had always believed in, the endless capacity of consciousness to adapt, to grow, to transcend its own limitations. Whatever they decide, she whispered, we've already proved it's possible. Zach Seth's scales shifted to that unique pattern they had discovered together, the one that meant neither human grief nor Meridian logic, but something new, understanding. Yes, he replied, his voice carrying traces of emotion that would have been unthinkable a year ago. We have done what both our species thought impossible. We have found strength in shared grief, and wisdom in the spaces between logic and emotion. Above them, the council began their announcements, but in that moment, both scientists knew that the real work, the work of healing, of growth, of connection, had already succeeded. In helping each other understand grief, they had discovered something far more profound, the universal language of consciousness itself.